A boy sat motionless at the edge of his own graduation party, hearing aids tucked beneath his hair, watching 40 mouths move at once and understanding none of them. The backyard had been transformed for the occasion. String lights threaded through the oak trees, a rented popcorn machine humming in the corner, a banner that read "Congratulations, 5th grade graduate" in gold foil letters that caught the late afternoon sun. Folding tables sagged under trays of food nobody had touched yet. Somewhere near the fence, a Bluetooth speaker played a playlist some other parent had made, bass thumping up through the grass. 40-some guests filled the yard. Neighbors, co-workers from the dealership, 2 city council members who'd shown up because Harold Quint had asked them to, and a cluster of his daughter's old sorority friends who'd known the family for 15 years. In the middle of it sat Wesley, 10 years old, perched on the edge of a lawn chair, with a paper plate of cake balanced on his knees, untouched. He wasn't avoiding the party was avoiding him. It happened the way these things always happened. Not through cruelty, never through cruelty, but through the slow erosion of 100 small choices nobody thought twice about. A kid would walk over, say something, watch Wesley's eyes track desperately to his lips, get embarrassed when he didn't catch it, laugh awkwardly, and drift back to the group by the cooler, where the conversation moved at a speed he could follow. It happened 4 times in the first 20 minutes. By the 5th time, no one came over at all. His hearing loss wasn't total, it had been progressive, a slow theft that started when he was 6, after a series of ear infections the doctors never fully explained, deepening year over year until by 9, conversation in a noisy room became a guessing game he mostly lost. He read lips well. He'd learned some sign language on his own, from videos, because nobody around him had bothered to learn it with him. His hearing aids helped with one-on-one conversation, in a quiet room. They did almost nothing in a backyard full of 40 people, a bass-heavy playlist, and the clatter of paper plates. Across the yard, his father, Harold Quint, was deep in conversation with 3 men in golf polos, all gesturing at something on someone's phone. Probably the new property he was about to close on for the dealership's 3rd location. Harold owned Quint Motors, the largest used car dealership chain in 3 counties, the kind of business that had made him locally famous for handshake deals, and a face that showed up on every billboard along Route 9. He was good at this. He'd built an empire out of being likable, in rooms exactly like this one. He glanced toward Wesley every few minutes, long enough to confirm his son was sitting. Not long enough to notice he was sitting alone. It hadn't always been like this. 2 years earlier, before the hearing loss had fully taken hold, Wesley had been the loudest kid on his street. The one organizing neighborhood kickball games, narrating his own bike stunts at top volume, talking through dinner until his mother told him to let someone else get a word in. His mother, Caroline, used to say he'd talk to a fence post if there was nothing else around. Caroline had died 18 months ago, an aneurysm, sudden and merciless, on a Tuesday morning while she was making coffee. Harold found her on the kitchen floor when he came down for breakfast. Wesley was already losing his hearing by then, but it was after that morning that the silence really started. First the silence of grief, and then, more and more, the literal kind. As if the world had decided to take from him gradually what it had taken from his mother all at once. Harold had not handled it well. Not the dying, and not the going deaf. He wasn't an unkind man. Anyone who knew him would say the opposite, that he was generous to a fault, the guy who covered a stranger's layaway at Christmas, who hired ex-convicts at the dealership when nobody else would. But grief had made him into someone who solved problems with his checkbook, because his hands didn't know what else to do with themselves. He'd bought Wesley the newest hearing aid technology available, scheduled him with the best audiologist in the state, hired a tutor to help him keep up at school. He had not once, sat down and learned a single sign in American Sign Language. He told himself there wasn't time. He told himself the hearing aids were working well enough. He told himself a lot of things, in the way people do when looking directly at something, would cost more than they're prepared to pay. Today's party was supposed to be simple, a 5th grade graduation, a small milestone, cake and lawn games. But somewhere in the planning it had absorbed half of Harold's professional orbit, because 3 of his most important business contacts happened to be free this weekend, and Harold had thought, why not, kill 2 birds? They can meet Wesley, see the kind of family man I am. The guest list had swollen from 12 kids, and their parents to nearly 50 people, most of whom had no idea what Wesley's life actually sounded like. Wesley watched the other kids, 2 of them now playing cornhole near the fence, 3 more chasing each other around the popcorn machine, and felt the particular loneliness of being surrounded. He wasn't excluded by cruelty. He was excluded by velocity. The world simply moved faster than he could follow, and nobody slowed down to wait for him, because slowing down required noticing, and noticing required looking. He set the cake down on the side table, uneaten, and folded his hands in his lap. That was when Renee Castellano walked through the side gate. She wasn't on the guest list, not really. She'd come because her younger cousin Dash was in Wesley's class, and had begged her for a ride, since his mom was working a double. Renee was 29, a special education teacher at the elementary school 2 towns over. Though she didn't teach at Wesley's school, and had never met him before, she had the kind of face that noticed things. Not nosy, just attentive, the product of 6 years spent in classrooms full of kids whose needs didn't announce themselves loudly. She clocked Wesley within about 40 seconds of walking in, not because anything about him screamed for attention, quite the opposite. It was the stillness. The careful, practiced stillness of a kid who had learned to make himself small, so that his isolation wouldn't be visible to the people responsible for ending it. She watched the hearing aids catch the light when he turned his head. She watched him track lips, not faces. She watched the small flinch when the speaker volume jumped and 3 kids near him laughed at something he clearly hadn't caught. Renee had learned ASL not for any single dramatic reason, but because her university program had required it, and then because 2 of her early students used it, and then because it had simply become part of who she was, the way a second language settles into someone and stops feeling foreign. She didn't think of it as a skill she was about to deploy. She thought of it as a sentence she already knew how to say. She crossed the yard, knelt down in front of Wesley so they were eye level, made sure she had his attention, and signed, "My name is Renee, can I sit with you?" For a second, Wesley didn't move at all. Nobody, not one adult at this party, not his father, not his teachers, not the audiologist who fitted his hearing aids every 6 months, had ever signed a single sentence to him. He had taught himself the alphabet from a library book 2 summers ago, then basic phrases from grainy YouTube videos. He watched alone in his room, with the volume off, because there was no one to practice with, and it felt less lonely to learn it in silence than to ask someone to learn it with him. He signed back, slowly, like he wasn't sure his hands still remembered how. "Yes, please." She sat. Not across from him at a polite party-appropriate distance, but right beside him, angled so he could see her face and hands without turning his head. She asked him, in sign, what grade he'd just finished. She asked what his favorite subject was. He told her, hands a little clumsy at first, and then faster, more sure, the way a stutter sometimes disappears, the moment someone stops waiting impatiently for you to finish a sentence. Dash wandered over a few minutes later, saw his cousin signing with the quiet kid from his class, and, with the uncomplicated decency of a 9-year-old who hasn't yet learned to be embarrassed by kindness, sat down too and asked Renee to teach him a few signs so he could talk to Wesley as well. Within 10 minutes, 2 more kids had drifted over, curious, and Renee was sitting in the grass with 4 children around her, finger-spelling names, laughing when somebody got it wrong, slow enough that Wesley could follow every word. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Wesley was at the center of a conversation, instead of at the edge of one. From across the yard, Harold Quint noticed the small crowd forming around his son and felt the first flicker of something, not yet recognition, just a vague tug, the kind that makes a man glance over mid-sentence and lose his place. He excused himself from the men in golf polos and crossed the lawn. What he found stopped him cold. His son was laughing. Not the careful performative laugh Wesley had been doing for company lately. The one Harold had started to assume was just who his son was now. But something looser, easier, his whole face open in a way Harold hadn't seen since before Caroline died. He was signing rapidly with a woman Harold had never met, hands moving with a fluency that suggested he'd been practicing this for a long time, in private with no one. Harold felt something crack open in his chest. Not the sharp pain of bad news. The slower, more devastating kind, the realization that his son had been carrying a whole language, a whole private fluency, completely alone, for months, maybe longer, and Harold had been too busy providing for him to ever ask what he actually needed. He didn't introduce himself right away. He stood a few feet back and watched, the way you watch something you're afraid to interrupt. It was Renee who looked up first. She stood, brushed grass off her knees, and held out her hand. "Renee Castellano. I'm Dash's cousin, hope it's okay I crashed." "Harold," he said, shaking her hand, his eyes drifting back to his son, who was now teaching one of the other boys the sign for cake, grinning the whole time. "How do you?" He stopped, started again. "How long have you been signing with him?" "About 15 minutes, Renee said gently. "He already knew more than I expected. He's clearly been teaching himself." Harold absorbed that the way a man absorbs a diagnosis. "Nobody taught him, I never." His voice caught somewhere it hadn't caught since the funeral. "I never learned. I kept telling myself there wasn't time." Rennie didn't rush to comfort him, and she didn't let him off the hook either. "There's time now," she said simply. "He's 10. He's got a lot more conversations left to have." Later, when the cake had finally been cut, and the council's members had said their goodbyes, and the golf polo men had drifted back to their phones, Renee did something that changed the shape of the rest of the afternoon. She asked Wesley, in sign, if he wanted to teach the other kids a game, something that didn't depend on hearing the rules shouted across a yard. Wesley thought about it, then signed back. "Charades, but with our hands only, no so sound at all, everyone has to use ASL or guess by watching." It shouldn't have worked. It worked beautifully. 12 kids spent the next half hour, in helpless, silent laughter, miming and finger-spelling and falling over each other, trying to guess what their friends were signing, and for the first time at his own party, Wesley wasn't the kid being accommodated. He was the kid who knew the rules better than anyone else, the one the others kept turning to for help. Harold watched from the porch steps, arms crossed, jaw tight in the particular way of a man, trying not to cry in front of his business associates. One of the council members caught him watching and said, not unkindly, "Your boy seems happy." "He is right now," Harold said. "I'm going to make sure he stays that way." After the last guests left and the lights along the fence had been unplugged, Harold sat down across from Wesley at the kitchen table, the same table where Caroline used to make him do his spelling homework, and, slowly, painfully, using the few signs he half remembered from a video he'd watched once and forgotten, asked his son to teach him. It took him 4 tries to get through. "I am sorry," without giving up. Wesley didn't make it easy on him, not because he was punishing his father, but because that's how learning works. You fumble it until your hands remember. But he stayed at the table. He corrected his father's handshapes patiently, the way Renee had corrected the other kids that afternoon. And somewhere in the middle of that kitchen table lesson, something shifted between them that no audiologist appointment, or expensive piece of technology, had managed to touch in 18 months. In the weeks that followed, Harold enrolled in a beginner ASL class at the community college 2 nights a week. The first class he'd taken since business school. He asked Renee, with considerable awkwardness, whether she'd be willing to come by occasionally and help. Both of them quietly aware that the request was about more than language lessons. Quint Motors, under his direction, started a program offering on-site ASL training for any employee who wanted it, beginning with the service department, where 2 technicians and a front desk coordinator signed up in the first week. He didn't announce it with a press release. He just did it, the way Wesley had taught himself to sign, quietly, without waiting for permission. Wesley started inviting Dash and 2 of the kids from the charades game over after school. They didn't always sign, sometimes they just used phones and exaggerated gestures, and a lot of laughing at their own mistakes. But the gap between Wesley and the world had narrowed in a way that no hearing aid upgrade had ever managed. Months later, on a Saturday that meant nothing official, no graduation, no milestone, just an ordinary afternoon, Harold threw a small backyard cookout. No council members, no business contacts. Just Wesley's friends Renee and Dash, a few neighbors, hot dogs on a cheap grill Harold had owned for a decade. At one point, someone put on music, and instead of a Bluetooth speaker thumping bass no one could parse, Wesley taught the whole group to sign the lyrics along with the song, badly, all of them laughing at how slow and clumsy their hands were. Wesley sat in the middle of it, not at the edge, talking with his hands to a yard full of people who had finally learned to listen the way he needed them to. Harold stood by the grill, watching his son's hands move through the air like he was conducting something, and understood, fully, and at last, what Caroline had probably always known. That love isn't the size of the party you throw. It's whether anyone in the room is willing to learn your language.